All right, can you all see my screen? Give me a thumbs up. Great, I'll just start it there. Well, it is really wonderful to be here. I'm thrilled to meet you all virtually, and I'm excited to share some of my work. I'll be happy to continue the conversation going forward, but it's lovely to have you all. So I'm going to talk to you about some of my work. In California, the background slide is a NASA blue marble of California. It's from some years ago. It's more typical, being very dry. We've been in a prolonged drought, as we were talking about before. We've had 3 weeks of pretty near continuous atmospheric rivers hitting the state. We had one sunny day yesterday. And so if I were to show you this picture today, it would be so beautiful because all of the mountains are just packed with snow. So it's been truly crazy 3 weeks, but we're glad for it. So I'm going to talk to you about some of my work, and I really believe all of these fields that we're interested in: geography, ecology, planning, anytime you're doing disaster response, anything natural resources management, it always starts with a map. Now, I borrowed this from our U.S. National Reserve Research Council. They have a monograph that says disaster response always starts with a map. But I think, everything always starts with a map, really. And to me, a map, in all of our terminology, means a GIS. And all of us are GI science people. We've all seen graphics like this where we, may perhaps put these in our classrooms or learn this in our classrooms. A GIS, it's a system for the acquisition, management, analysis, and dissemination of spatial data, geospatial data. And what is geospatial data? It's these two-dimensional layers that we take the 3D world and we strip down into these layers of unique data formats, and all the analytical power is made possible because they are georeferenced. They're stored in such a way that we can find them on the face of the earth. But we've seen this a million times, but our GIS world is really changing. We have new data streams from phones, from models, from satellites, from drones, from field sensors. We have amazing new technological advances in computing, new ways to integrate data, new ways to share data, to create reproducible workflows, machine learning, AI, distributed computing. All these things mean a new computing landscape is emerging. I think there's more public focus on geography in a strange way because we see maps so much more. There's more ways for people to interact with geography. Data can be more personal. We can all map our walks, our bike paths, but at the same time, data can be more global. And I think the spatial technological landscape is more relevant than it's ever been before. And there's more chances and more need to collaborate. And so I'm, moving away from this idea of GIS into, we use GI science too, but this idea of spatial data science, I think, is resonating. And what that means to me is it's this bringing together of these new data streams, this analytical landscape, and then making a difference for people. So when we talk about data, we can talk about sensors and models and, remote sensing and portals. Participatory data, I'm very excited about. Drone data, I'm excited about it all, really. We can talk about all these different ways of pulling these data together and analyzing them and making use of them. New data aggregation tools, new models, some very cool stuff in space-time, and lovely new design and cartography analytics. And all of these can be proprietary or they can be open. But at the end of the day, it's all about why. What's the impact we can make? How do we collaborate, and how do we engage? But these three things together, the sort of people data tools, although they're all underpinned by theory, I don't want to say this is a theory-free zone. It's not, but these are sort of the front end to what makes these things exciting to me. And so I wanted to share with you 3 case studies from my work that highlight one of each of these: tools, data, people. But remember, it's all sort of wound together. So each of these 3 stories, which I'm going to tell you briefly, share a lot. But I'm going to foreground some of one of each of these things: tools or data or people. So I'm going to start by talking about how do we map forests in a very dynamic state, and foreground this emerging analytics landscape that's being created and is necessitated by the new data streams that are happening. I'm going to tell you about some kind of a labor of love for me over the last couple of decades, working with some historical ecological data and these concepts around data resilience. And then I'll focus on some of our recent drone work and how we're trying to engage public through that. So the first I'm going to start with are mapping forests. And we do most of our forest mapping through remote sensing. And just a quick primer, I know you all know this, but we have passive remote sensing that makes use of the energy from the sun. So energy from the sun is reflected, and our satellites or sensors can measure that. And then we have active remote sensing, where we're using energy that we are creating. And most commonly, we're talking about lidar. So it's visible and near infrared light, but it's in a laser format. And the response is not just a simple reflective component. We can get a measure of actually how much energy was reflected off of surfaces, and not just how much in a bundle, but how much in separate discrete bundles, or how much in a continuing signal. So these are the main difference between passive and active remote sensing. And passive remote sensing platforms, there are many, and they are so useful. So we have the workhorse of the Earth observation world, Landsat, 6-band, roughly, couple week return, 30-meter, a little bit smaller resolution. We now have Sentinel, and I know you guys in Europe use Sentinel all the time. It's a lovely, wonderful sensor. We also have planet imagery, which I'm starting to make more use of. We have other sensors like Worldview. And then, of course, we have imagery on demand from UAVs and drones. And what these passive remote sensing products have given us have been fantastic for forest work. We can do classification, we can map change, we can understand forest condition through indices like NDVI or greenness. We can estimate ecosystem components like canopy cover or biomass. If the resolution is small enough, we can do feature extraction and pull out individual crowns or gaps. And then structure. The structure is sort of what we really need to understand forests and to understand how disturbances move through forests. And structure isn't really perfect with optical or passive remote sensing. And that's where the active remote sensing comes in. And that's where we're going to focus and talk briefly about LiDAR. So this is a still, and here's the video of a LiDAR point cloud. And each of these dots is a single return from that active beam of energy that's sent from an aircraft, usually an aircraft. And then the amount of time it takes for that individual piece of light to come back to the receiver tells us how far away the aircraft is from that leaf or trunk or ground that's being reflected. And so therefore we can tell the height of that particular return. And when we pool all these returns together and then strip them apart to make out individual objects or trees, we can do a lot. So these LiDAR data the point cloud itself is a massive, just a massive number of X, Y, Z and intensity variables, and we can so then we can do various routines to pull out these individual shapes, these trees, and from individual trees we can get the crown shape, we can get the crown size, we can get the crown height, we know its location. We've done a lot of work looking at fire, and so if there's what are called ladder fuels, which are smaller stature shrubs or other trees that bring ground fire up into the crown, we can map that. We can map the canopy cover, we can get at biomass, we can get at tree density, we can get at spacing of trees and pattern of trees. And so all of this structural information we really couldn't have gotten well with the passive remote sensing, but all of this does an amazing amount of work for us when we're thinking about dynamics, because we can fly LiDAR before and after an event. So in this case, it's before and after a forest fuel treatment, which we've been doing in California to try to remove some of the density of the forest structure. And we can actually measure how much was removed during these treatments by flying before and after and actually measuring the changes in these individual stems and how much biomass change. So multi-temporal LiDAR is coming on strong as a very important tool in terms of forest dynamics, but LiDAR creates incredibly flexible and useful data. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but LiDAR can be used to create detailed vegetation mapping for wildlife habitat, to map these key ecological components of forests that I've been mentioning: biomass, vertical structure, ladder fuels, large tree density. We've used it, and many other people are using these as these default inputs to fire behavior models so that we can understand better and model how a particular fire might spread. Topography, canopy height, canopy cover, canopy base height, these sorts of things. We use LiDAR to map forest structure and fuels and the dynamics therein. And then increasingly with higher energy LiDAR sensors, we can get at not just that individual tree, but down to the leaf scale or within plant structure. What is the branching pattern? What is the leaf structure pattern? And then all of that can be integrated with optical imagery to great effect. And I mentioned at the beginning, we're mostly talking about airborne LiDAR, but that's changing. So here's the spectrum of LiDAR that's available, from spaceborne down to backpack mobile LiDAR and terrestrial LiDAR. And these last two, mobile and terrestrial, are pretty exciting. This is some mobile backpack LiDAR data that we've been using to measure really detailed orchard tree crown structure. So you're actually walking down the rows here of this almond orchard. And we've done this in other areas too. These sorts of data are allowing us to really precisely measure individual trees. And as I said before, not just individual tree structure or individual plant structure, but also the branching pattern, how trees, how plants are growing through the growing season in very detailed 3D. And now you can get LiDAR on your phone, which I've been playing around with a little bit. And there's been some neat papers coming out highlighting there's a lot of open source and free tools that you can use with your phone. This one just came from a year ago, and in my experience, it's a lot easier to do this with rocks than it is to do with trees, I think, but these things will be getting better. But on the strength of these new remotely sensed data, we have to create a better analytics landscape to deal with it. And no longer is it just you've got your one sort of tool of choice. If you're talking about broad scale spatial data science or GI science toolboxes, we have our Esri suite, we have Google Earth Engine, We have R and Python, and then of course Jupyter Notebooks that's incorporating a lot of these things together. But there's also an emerging landscape coming out of the machine learning world. There's new tools coming out in support of UAV and drone work. And then there's more exciting climate data sets and data analytics packages, and then of course lidar packages. So it's important to not be an expert in all of these, but to stay au courant with what's happening, how this emerging landscape is growing. So when I think about the tools, I really think about tools as they are your portal to understanding the dynamic world. They are the way that you are going to engage with the data, and they can be open or proprietary, they can be local or they can be cloud-based, they can be niche or custom, and they can be scalable. But in the end of the day, they should support reproducibility and transparency. That's what we're going for. So part two is this historical. We're going to take a step back and think about historical data. And I know in the UK, I don't know much about Ireland, but I imagine that there are historical data sets that go a lot deeper than we have in California. But in California, we had a pioneer, really, Albert Wieslander, who in the 20s and 30s launched an amazing effort to survey the lands of California and do vegetation type mapping. And it started out really as sort of a focus on, it was paid for by the Forest Service, but these folks really did an amazing job of mapping California's floristic diversity. So it's considered one of the finest ever made in the Western Hemisphere. It was foundational for all of the US vegetation and soil type mapping that went after it. And these crews went out throughout California and they collected photographs, they collected plots, they created vegetation type maps, and they took herbarium specimens. And the wonderful thing about all of them was, so the vegetation type maps were on USGS topographic quads. The plot data were stored in these plot cards and then located on USGS topo maps. The photographs were taken and the vantage point of the photographs was located on topo maps, and the herbarium specimens also. So all of these were geolocated, but they were all sort of separated, and the physical copies were stored in various libraries around the state or in private collections. And I've been involved with several others in this long-term, multi-decade process to bring these back together and digitize them. But I'll just show you quickly a few of the examples. So these were, again, done in the 1920s and 30s. These are vegetation, hand-drawn vegetation type mapping. Lots of detail went into these, really quite beautiful, as you can see here. To assist the vegetation type mapping, the crews would take plot data. So it's about 18,000 plots that they sampled from, and they would locate where the plots were on these USGS topo maps. They also took some lovely photographs. They lugged their camera equipment out into the field. So they took these sorts of things. And so what this large crew has been doing is trying to pull together all of the physical copies and then digitize them. So we've been digitizing the vegetation maps. Jim Thorne at UC Davis has been the pioneer with this. We've digitized all of the plot data and the plot maps, and my lab and another lab were involved in this. We scanned all the photographs and geolocated them and geolocated all the specimens. So we pulled all this together. It's all hosted on an API, open source API for folks to use. And we've been working on it, doing some look at long-term changes to forests in California. And it's well known that California forests have changed dramatically in the 20th century due to fire suppression and many other things. And, we're not the first people to say this, but there's a lot of interest in how forests have changed in the 20th century. So we took all of the plots that we could find, and then the Forest Service in the United States has a process called the Forest Inventory and Analysis process, and they do every 10 years they go out and do inventory on forested lands in the US. And so these aren't exactly co-located, but we did some GIS magic, and the results were really pretty clear. So changes in forest structure, so forests in the 1930s versus forests in the 2000s. The first is that there are way less big trees, and we know this. And the second most important result is there are many, many more smaller trees. It's a much denser forest, and we talked a little bit about that in the first chapter of my talk today. But despite there being so many more stems, the forest itself is a less biomass heavy forest. So biomass has gone down. So these three changes were extremely striking when you compare the historical data to the current data. And when you look at explanatory factors, one that really stood out was this climate water deficit, which is a modeled product, but it's been modeled for the state of California historically for the 20th century. And climate water deficit was a very strong explanatory factor to help explain these changes in big trees, small trees, and biomass. And when we published this paper, we got a lot of feedback saying you're missing the point. This isn't a climate signal. This has to do with management. This has to do with how these forests are managed. And so, we thought, okay, let's take a step back and think about this more broadly, because we said there's a real strong climate signal. So we said, okay, maybe it's a climate signal, maybe it's a forest management signal in terms of logging, and then maybe it's a fire management and suppression signal. So we re-looked at California and broke it down in terms of its management regimes. So California has a lot of different ways that forests are managed, from national parks to private lands to state parks to Bureau of Land Management to Forest Service land to private timberland. And our hypothesis was that if that climate signal showed up throughout these management regimes, then it would be more evidence that the climate signal was pronounced. And that is indeed exactly what we found. We found that this climate signal was consistent across the state with some variation, but that different management types were still experiencing the same sorts of changes with some differences. So that was a really important result. And it's all because of this concept of, I like to call it data resilience. And I didn't invent this term. I learned about it from Dawn Wright, as well as several others. So Dawn Wright, in one of her key papers here, says this great quote: "If mapping and information tools are to help communities, it stands to reason that they must be resilient themselves, as well as the data they are based on." And so we have to think about, what it's going to take to make sure data sets are resilient, that they are created and stored and shared in a way that other people can use them, and that they can remain useful. And so this concept, I'm sure you've heard about it, called FAIR, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we are really trying to embrace this FAIR data concept in all our work. And one of my grad students, Kelly Easterday, made this great graph where she was involved in this VTM project, as well as several other historical data sets, where we've got to take this dark data or analog data and move it down the path to open data, to making it fair. And so this is the take home for the data section, is that data is your way to understand process. Spatial data will reveal the process. It will unleash the secrets, and we can talk about data in terms of its detail or its resolution. We can talk about data in terms of its breadth or coverage. We can think about data as being very focused or having a very broad reach. But at the end of the day, I'd like us to continue to think about how do we make data resilient, and then, always be guided by follow the data. The data is going to reveal the process that you're interested in. And so the third case is another project that we've been working on, and we've been doing a lot of work with drone imagery. And here I wanted to highlight sort of the public outreach aspects of my work. That does run through everything, but we'll talk a little bit about UAVs or drones. And so drones are big right now. They're a lot of folks are using them, and one of the key advantages of drone imagery is the spatial resolution. Here I've got a pre-fire color infrared panel on the top and a post-fire color infrared panel on the bottom. The top goes from, well, they both go from high resolution to coarser resolution. So we've got aerial imagery compared with drone imagery on the left panel, planet imagery in the middle, and Landsat imagery on the right. And you can immediately see, if you are interested in what's happening on a per crown basis, which we are, you're really not going to be able to get that with Landsat. And you can get a little bit with Planet, but not much. So that's the first advantage. The second advantage is that when you're flying drones, you're in control. You have mission planning software. You can decide how you want to fly. You can decide when you want to fly. You can create a flight plan that then you can repeat through a growing season or before and after event, or all these sorts of things. A second advantage are the sensors that are on board drones. So not just RGB camera, but also multispectral camera or thermal cameras or lidar sensors. Another advantage are these indices that can be gleaned from the cameras. So for the multi-spec cameras, we can get our old favorite NDVI, but with some of the new cameras, we can get this normalized difference red edge. And the red edge is that area of the spectral reflectance curve here at the top of the slide, where we go from absorption in red to high reflectance in the near infrared. And that red edge, the slope of that line is going to tell us a lot about the leaf. But we can also do a lot with just visible imagery. So there's a RGB visible light index called VARI, which is just green minus red over green plus red minus blue. And it actually does a pretty great job if that's all you can have, if that's the only camera you can have. So that's another advantage. So these advantages mean that UAVs or drones can be particularly useful. And we've been playing with or experimenting with these on in several agricultural settings. We've been looking at how can drone imagery, mostly multispectral, help us understand varietal growth and yield, or minimize pests and diseases, or how can this imagery help agricultural managers with their crops? And so our remotely sensed goal is to create detailed tree-based databases of imagery from these various fields. And we've done this a couple of places. We're working at a research and extension center in the Southern Valley that focuses on citrus. And we're working on with a experimental ranch and field that focuses on pistachio. And all of this, the remote sensing goal is creating these tree-based databases of trees through time. And when you talk about high resolution imagery and you talk about creating individual tree maps, There's a few ways to do it, and an old, sort of an old-fashioned way, although we still read papers where folks are doing this. One way to do it is to manually pick out these individual trees on high-resolution imagery. We've all done that. It's kind of boring. Then you get into the automated ways, and if you're looking at automated ways, you can, there's sort of two ends to the spectrum. One is a rule-based suite of tools that comes under the nomiker object-based image analysis, or OBIA, sometimes called GeoBIA, where groups of neighboring pixels are brought together based on commonalities in color, texture, and shape, and you pull these into segments, and then you classify those segments. These OBIA methods produce these lovely detailed polygons of individual objects like tree crowns. On the other end of the spectrum are these deep learning tools like convolutional neural networks that train models using massive amounts of training data to find like shapes. And so the output for these deep learnings tools are kind of heat maps that say the probability of this pixel being part of a tree is very, very high. And you can then, pull those into groups. So we've been playing around with some of these methods. The first we've looked at, this is the Lynn Cove citrus stuff. And our goal here was to create this tree-based database of these individual citrus trees using the deep learning tool, convolutional neural networks, to pull out individual trees efficiently and accurately. And the twist was that it wasn't a uniform, because it's an experimental ranch. There are trees of different growing stages. There are different angles. It wasn't just a very, very simple task. And so we did this pretty well, and you can use these convolutional neural networks to pull out individual trees, and then for each individual tree, you can ask of it, what's your vegetation condition status through NDVI or NDRE. You can look at how does that vary across the field, and you can see here in that middle panel that there's a lot of edge effects in terms of NDVI or NDRE that wouldn't necessarily be seen with just the imagery. And then because drone data gives you this lidar-like point cloud, because you are flown everything at multiple angles, you can actually also get a 3D point cloud to get at tree volume. So it's really, really extremely promising. We also, as I said, we're working in this pistachio field, and here the idea was we wanted to fly it through the growing season to get at when would be a good time to fly, or how much do you need to fly to capture to help predict field-based measurements. And these field-based measurements are, yield relevant measures. We go out in the field and we measure tree height, we measure trunk diameter, we measure volume, we measure size, but it's very labor intensive. How much can we get from drone-based imagery, and when do we need to fly? That was sort of our task here. And here we used not convolutional neural networks, we used object-based image analysis to pull out each individual crown through time. And some of the take-home messages on this were that the UAV data predicted really well the field-based measures, trunk width, crown size, tree height, and crown volume, but in the mid part of the growing season, not at the tail ends, which probably isn't surprising. But these kinds of links are very helpful for management, because they can be used to predict yield, or at least tell us something about potential yield. And the second thing that was really exciting about this was being able to capture the growing season dynamics. So early season green up, peak greenness, end of season decline, and then really understand differences in early season leaf development. And so we just used pretty simple NDVI and found that it was very powerful in this. So UAVs, I think, are going to be part of our remote sensing GIScience landscape for a while. We're going to, in my mind, we're going to be using these to think about scaling. How do we scale from UAV up to Landsat, for example? That's in the panel there. They're also going to be really important for understanding dynamics. I showed you a little bit about that, and this was through a growing season, but you could also think about how do we understand really fine resolution dynamics, hourly or daily dynamics with plants. We're going to see a concurrent emergence of new cloud-based computing and data management for drone data, which hasn't really emerged completely yet. And then we need to think about, how do we share these data? How do we think about fair drone data? And so that last part, how do we think about integrating people into this, brings me to my close on this particular chapter. One of the things we do in my group, we are part of this large consortium. We do something called Drone Camp every year. We're doing it again in 2023. It's on site in Monterey, down the coast for me a bit, but it's also virtual. So if any of you are interested in this, the time change might be a bit rough, but it's a great week-long tour into the world of drones. We talk about mission planning and risk and regulation and equipment, and how do you actually fly, and doing some troubleshooting, and then data processing and data management. It's a lot of fun. I do all of this work through the University of California. I'm at the University of California at Berkeley, but I'm also part of what's called the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources Division. And this is where where California land grant is situated, and cooperative extension. And I don't know what the equivalent is in the UK of cooperative extension. I think there might be something, but I'd love to learn a little bit more about that. So all of my work, we have a lot of statewide programs through the University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources, and they're focused on things like agriculture, natural resources, nutrition, youth development. And I do a lot of work integrating GIS, spatial data science, all of these things throughout, helping with integrated pest management, or helping with our California Naturalist program, where we have volunteers going out and collecting citizen science data. I wanted to just bring this up in case this rings a bell with any of you out there, and we could talk about commonalities across the world. But my group is focused on the sort of GIS portion of all of this. So the closing slide for this particular chapter is just to emphasize the importance of collaboration. Collaboration is necessary for impact. All of my work, I try to think about who are the groups of people that need to be at the table, and how are we going to communicate these things? I work with scientists, with the public, I work with tribes, with policymakers, with industry, with land managers. And at the end of the day, I think mapping makes these kinds of exchanges between groups smoother and more powerful, and it's more critical than ever. And so I'm going to wrap up here. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm really thinking more about not GIS, but spatial data science, and how do we incorporate all of these to map, to make a better world, and the challenges that we face together today around food and water and equity and energy and all of these things. They're all complex. They all have a spatial component to them, and they all impact diverse public groups. And so addressing all of these means we need innovative ways to collect data, to synthesize data, to analyze data, and to communicate and collaborate across groups. And so that's my take home. I hope it was interesting, and I'd love to chat with you a little bit more. So I will stop sharing. Would that be a good idea?
You can leave your slide for a moment, Maggie,
Okay.
in case people want to take your email address or the various links.
Good idea.
Maggie, that was a really fascinating talk, and it's a real pity we can't extend and learn some more. There's a couple of questions in the chat at the moment, and I'll just make another call. If you have a question, please type it there. We have a few minutes. I'll start directly. Duncan was first in, so first question. He's looking to know a little bit about the typical amount of data you're needing for training those CNNs.
Oh yeah, it's a great question. And it does depend on which particular model you're going to use. There are many out there to choose from, but in general, we're talking about hundreds of samples. I mean, it's going to vary. So that is one challenge with some of these deep learning tools. The case that I showed you from LinCove, we actually had, a pretty nice hand-done digitized data set where, an analyst had plopped down the centroid of the trees. And so that was extremely helpful because, like I said, we had big trees and we had small trees. So the finding the training data to run these is part of the challenge. But there are data sets that are being produced, public, open data sets that are being produced that are designed to be the training data sets to help refine your machine learning or your deep learning algorithms. So it's a great question.
I'm going to go to Phil's question next because it's a technical question, and then Nick has a nice question that's more about the accessibility and including people in the whole research process. So Phil is asking and mentioning it's an interesting talk, and I think we all agree with that after classifying the trees from imagery, you use a 3D point cloud for volume calculations, but are there any issues here in regions being incorrectly classified because of the 2D to 3D overhead, I suppose? And then have you looked at classification directly using the 3D point cloud, so PointNet, for example?
Yeah, these are great questions. So let's break it down. And I'm trying to find the question in chat just so I can refer to it. You said it was Phil's?
Yeah, it's just a second.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. So the first question is, if you are going to create a volume measure from a 3D point cloud, what if you incorrectly include, some junk in that in the point cloud? And that's absolutely can happen. We are talking about an orchard setting here, so it's a little bit better than in a closed canopy forest, but you absolutely have this problem, and you have it even in the lidar stuff I was talking about before, and there it's closed canopy. And so you're, pulling out these individual trees from a closed canopy and figuring out what's a tree and what's a shrub is really problematic. The more point cloud you have, it makes it sometimes a little bit easier, but it's just more problematic in a closed canopy forest than it is in an orchard. But there's been some really exciting work. Obviously, the challenge is under the tree line. So here we have the point cloud getting to the top of the tree, and where from the bottom of the tree to the ground, you can get some error. And so there's been some really neat work fusing ground-based or backpack mobile lidar with aerial lidar, so you get a better look at the actual shape of the tree. So great point. Are there issues? Have you looked at classification directly? Yes, absolutely. And that's part of what we did in that the LinCove study was, I didn't really make this very clear, but the second slide where we talked about volume, that was done directly using the 3D point cloud.
And I'll just go back then to Nick's question. it kind of intersected with something I was thinking about myself, about the drone imagery. And as Nick says, it's fascinating, huge potential. Now, you did mention about fair access to data. So Nick is asking, how accessible is this? And in terms of time, people, funding, training, can you give some kind of an overview of that? Because I was interested in something like that about training farmers themselves to use drones, and you maybe getting, so if you could make some comments on that.
Yeah, so the training part, that's why we started Drone Camp. So we've been doing it now for 6 years. That's it. The thing about drones that's so great is you're in control, but the problem with drones is that you're in control. So there's so many things that can go south when you have to fly it instead of just downloading it from a satellite vendor. So training is absolutely critical. And so, if honestly, if there was enough impetus to, if you guys wanted our material, or we wanted to, if you want to do something like this in the UK, please let me know. We're very, all of our data, everything that we do in Drone Camp is on YouTube anyway. So there's that too. I could send you the YouTube channel. What was the rest? I'm really sorry. I have, where was the first? This is exciting. This is really important question. So the first part of Nick's question was about data accessibility. Fair drone data is not where it needs to be. And it's not because people don't want to, it's because these data are not as uniform as satellite data. So there's some data formatting issues. There's so many ways that we could share drone data, from raw data to finished products. There's a lot of unknowns here. This is a big area that we need to work on. Karen Joyce in Australia has created a website, Open Drone. I'll find it and put it in the chat. And that's the first drone repo, open source repo that I know of, where you can go online, browse it, and find drone data. She really focuses on coastal habitats and seagrass and coral, etc. So there isn't really an equivalent for what I'm doing, but I would love to see more work on this.
And I'll just take one more question from the chat and then wrap up. And just to give everyone a chance to ask at least one question. The questions just come in there, Maggie. What is the challenge in dealing with very high resolution data? Would it introduce more noise? Sometimes the better data gives you some headaches sometimes that you didn't get
it's
with
not
pure,
sometimes.
yeah.
Yeah. It's like that song, right? More money, more problems. Well, more spatial resolution, more problems. So it definitely does introduce a lot of noise, and that's why we are abandoning the pixel-based algorithms that we developed for Landsat, and we're going with these object-based algorithms that actually pull objects together with a little bit more flexibility to deal with noise, and then go on to classify them. That's exactly where the Obaya paradigm was introduced, was to deal with this problem. It's now being, kind of taken over by the deep learning, machine learning tools that have their own ways of dealing with that noise, but you're absolutely right.
Excellent, Maggie. I'm sure there are people who will contact you after this to speak further. It was a really inspiring presentation and brought some issues that maybe some of us here in this part of Europe are not that familiar with: forest fires, and even just the simple scale of the landscape that you're dealing with. So I on behalf of GISRUK and RGS, thank you for an excellent presentation, and I am sure you'll be happy to consult with people if they want to learn more about your work. And I'll check out Drone Camp myself for myself and my students. Just before we close at 5 p.m, I just want to draw participants' attention to the GISRUK side of the room, because we have our conference in Glasgow this year in April 2023, and the call for papers, which has been extended, will be closing on Friday evening. So if you have a burning idea, if you have something that you would like to share with us and join us in Glasgow in April, please get writing now or get polishing off those abstracts before the deadline. So once again, on behalf of GISRUK and the RGS, Maggie, thank you very much for starting your day with us as we close ours. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.